I'll start us off with some questions, but then feel free to respond to one another rather than just answer questions each in turn, if that makes sense. So just a nice, easy, gentle question, like at the beginning of an interview for you all. What inspired you to pursue your vocation in biblical studies? Who would like to start?
Yeah, I think Horner should start.
Well, I don't know why you're turning to me. It says it's on. Is it on?
Yes.
Thank you. I just love the subject. And what better reason can there be? When I was at school, I was torn between doing a degree in English and doing a degree in maths, which were two rather different subjects. And then I discovered by chance that it was possible to read theology at university. In those days, it wasn't common at all. The only people reading theology were ordinands. And here I found there were degrees in theology. So I applied to do one, and I applied to do one at Bristol, where in the first year you could do English and maths as your preparation. And I thought, oh, this is God-given, isn't it? It's my favourite subject. So I applied to Bristol, and I arrived in Bristol. They didn't bother interviewing in those far-off days. I arrived in Bristol, and they said, maths? What's the good of maths for theology? You must do philosophy. Philosophy was not my favourite subject. But anyway, I embarked. And the other thing they said to me was, you've got to do Hebrew as well as Greek if you want an honours degree. And I nearly turned and fled at that point. The thought of learning Greek and Hebrew in the first year from scratch, you know. But anyway, I started. And after the first few weeks of struggling and nearly giving up on Hebrew, I absolutely loved the subject, and I was determined to go on and do more. But it was just the sheer joy of reading the scriptures. I can't say more.
Amen.
Thank you. Well, I'll be brief about this, but I think really my fascination with biblical studies goes back to when I was a teenager. And actually two things came together, I think, at that stage. I was extraordinarily interested in history, and in fact went on to do a degree in history and a PhD in history here in Cambridge. But at the same time as I was getting very interested in history, I was also thinking out my Christian faith, not only having it, but thinking about it, and whether it was credible, whether it made sense, all those kind of questions when I was a teenager. And the two things happily converged, because I realised, of course, there's a lot of history in the Bible. So I think those two things came together, and through a complicated history, I ended up eventually becoming a New Testament scholar and teaching New Testament. But it took quite a while, a complicated career that I won't bother to go into the details of. But yeah, it goes back a long, long way. And so an interest in biblical studies, it seems to me, absolutely natural thing. Why isn't everybody interested in biblical studies? Because it's been with me for most of my life.
Mine is a bit different. So my dad is a Methodist minister, and as a pastor's child, I was very, very reluctant to go down that road at all. I did love the Bible. You know, I sort of came to the Lord when I was 14 and had a habit, even as a teenager, of, you know, there was like a little sort of index or lexicon sort of thing in the back. It was like, oh, I want to learn about wisdom. And so I looked up every single verse that mentioned the word wisdom, of course, just in English. And but then around that time, when I started to feel this call, I was like, oh no, you know. And I thought, you know, because my dad's a pastor, and I thought, I know some of the drama that comes with that, and I'm definitely not going to go down that road. So I studied anthropology when I was an undergrad, and never even dreamed, didn't even think of becoming a Bible scholar at all. But then when 6 different professors and my parents came up to me separately and told me that I should probably become a Bible scholar, I thought, okay, maybe that's God telling me that this is something I need to do. And I have to say, yeah, I do love it. And I chose the first letter of John because 1 John 4 is the chapter most saturated on love. And I thought if I'm going to study anything, I think love is the core of the gospel. That's what makes Christianity different. And so I wanted to do that, and I did that with George, which I'm very grateful to him.
And your father's
And
here,
my
isn't
father
he?
is here. And so, yeah.
Well, I think good job parenting.
So unlike Mona, I started as a philosopher. So I started in the 19th century Hegelianism. And then I got a scholarship, Rotary Foundation scholarship from the University of Leiden. And they asked me to list five universities in order, and they would select to which university I would go. I couldn't decide between philosophy and New Testament studies. I had some interest in New Testament studies. So I ranked first Durham with Jimmy Dunn, and then second philosophy in Paris, the Institut Catholique. So the Rotary decided for me and sent me to Durham, to Jimmy Dunn. And so I rolled back in time from philosophy to the Middle Ages, and then to what I see as like Erasmus, as the source of evangelical philosophy, the New Testament. Therefore, my work is very much geared towards culture. So, what is the good news in the context of the Greco-Roman world? And I think that's also the relevance, but we come back to it, I think.
Okay, so thank you for telling us a little bit more of your journey in. Now, can I ask a slightly different question related to our theme? How does your doing of theology intersect with the life of the church? And why does that matter? You have the mic.
So when I was at Groningen, I've been in Groningen for 12 years. I was an honorary canon at the cathedral, Groningen Cathedral, with a responsibility for the second Sunday evening of the month. And the Netherlands are very secular, so I choose to give sermons in a liturgical setting, a lot of music for a atheistic public, secularists. So I found it very nourishing, very interesting to meet modern society in the Netherlands, engage in discussion. So that has been my focus of my ministry in the church: atheism and secularism, and try to find common ground, and there's plenty.
So do you want to just tell us a little bit about that common ground?
Yeah, so I think I'm quite interested in conversion. So people like David Suchet, who converted to Christianity by reading the letter to the Romans without reading, John Barclay's and my books. It's incredible. Apparently, reading. But what he said in one of the interviews is, I read it as literature. I read it as literature, and then I found that it's very relevant for myself. So to read it not within the constraints of the Bible, because I think there's a lot of hermeneutics that goes with the text if we read it as a Bible. We should open it up as literature, and then people will recognize the relevance. So David Suchet recognized the relevance. He said, "This is when I reached Romans 8, I found that this is my philosophy of life," and that's what I think is intriguing.
Shall I have a go? It depends a bit whether you mean the sort of local congregation to which one belongs, or the wider church. And the answers perhaps would be, let me just give you, I think perhaps two little illustrations of the importance of theology and scriptural studies in the life of the church. One, I lived in Scotland for 15 years, and I belonged to a home group there. We did Bible study and prayer together. And there was one rather elderly lady in that group. And she was a very faithful Christian, churchgoer all her life, devout Christian. But she said one day, I cannot believe in life after death. I really don't, it doesn't make any sense to me. And I thought a bit what I could do to help her. And what I did was I thought about it. I lent her a book by the Scottish theologian John Bailey, which is called And the Life Everlasting, published in 1948. I knew it quite well. I used to read it with theological students in Manchester. We went through it as a prescribed text. And I lent her this book. It's a very theological book, very deeply argued, but quite accessible, written in a way that anyone used to reading serious books could read. And she read it, and she said, "I'm completely convinced. I now believe in eternal life, and it makes good sense to me." And the lovely thing about the story, I think, is when she read the book, I don't think she had any reason to think she was approaching death, but she actually didn't. She actually did die not long after that. And I thought, because she read John Bailey's book, she was able to approach death with a hope of eternal life in God. The other illustration I was going to give, which is more sort of self-centered, is If You Like. But I think the book of mine that is best known in the wider church is my book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which was an argument, as probably quite a few of you know, that the Gospels as we have them are not very far from the eyewitness testimony given by those who are eyewitnesses of the events of the story of the Gospels. And it was quite a demanding book. I mean, I didn't write it to be a popular book. I wrote it with a lot of novel argument that I needed my fellow scholars to be able to respect and perhaps find convincing. So it wasn't an easy read. It won the Michael Ramsey Prize, which I think gave it a sort of some sort of initial kind of fame in the sense that the Michael Ramsey Prize nominates a book which is thought to be a theological book which will be of interest to the wider church. And what I found in the years after it came out, going around giving talks about it here and there, people emailing me about it, is it reached an extraordinarily wide audience, far more people than I would ever have expected to read it. And as I said, it's not an easy read, a thick book, it takes a good deal of reading. I realised actually that there are a lot of people out there in the pews that if you write something that actually appeals to what they're interested in, it can be a very solid piece of scholarly writing, but there are ways, of course, of making books like that relatively accessible. Unlike some of my colleagues, in a book like that, if I discuss the Greek, I always give the translation so that people without Greek can know what's going on. There are ways you can make things more accessible. But anyway, the point I want to make is how widely people were interested in the book, and still are, because it dealt with this, this issue is it the real Jesus that we meet in the Gospels? And many people pick up all sorts of ideas that are going around about that. A lot of people nowadays actually think Jesus was a mere legend, didn't even live. People are concerned about those issues, and the book, I think, spoke to what a lot of people just wanted to know about.
Do either of you want to come in?
Oh, well, I can just say that when I spent 5 years studying theology, felt that I wanted to give out as well as absorbing theology, the obvious way forward was to become a local preacher, which was the obvious way in the Methodist Church to which I belonged. And it was partly because I wanted to use the knowledge I gained positively. But I have to confess that it was partly a negative reaction to sitting week after week in the pew listening to preachers talk nonsense. The reason they talked nonsense was they hadn't studied the scriptures deeply enough. So here was something that I felt I could contribute.
Yeah. Is this okay? Yeah. I'll just comment on a couple things. Like, one is, and maybe some of you struggled with this as well, is the more you learned about theology and sort of biblical studies, the more you found it difficult to preach in a way, because your head was now filled with a lot of sort of distracting things, or things that you wanted to share because you're so excited about, the Greek word and what this meant, and you really want everyone to know that, and suddenly your sermon's like, 35 minutes longer than you expected, and and then you sort of have to cull your knowledge and sort of choose, sort of have like a 1-point sermon, what's your fundamental thing that you feel led by the Spirit to get across. And so the more that I learned, the more I had to sort of discern and really sort of pray into it and really think about what my point was. And I like to sort of preach toward the audience. And so when I was preaching to an international group from 40 different countries versus a sort of retired, well-to-do community in Massachusetts, I would sort of highlight different things depending on sort of what might speak to them more. And then, but it was a really useful exercise because, similar to what Morna was saying, it's easy to just sit in front of your computer, 8 hours a day and just like write. But when you have to really preach it and have people, what do they do with this knowledge? How do they live it out? What does God want people to, to know about it? And sort of feeling the responsibility to do that. It was a really good exercise for me as a scholar. And then, and the other thing I'll just comment briefly is podcasting. I think, now as podcasts are not only financially lucrative, but also people listen to podcasts all the time now, and they'll just put so much weight, and there's so much now with video podcasts as well, and people, while they're on their drive to work, while they're exercising, they'll listen and really be profoundly impacted even by this, 20-minute, 30-minute, 40-minute podcast. And so as much as I don't like being on stages like this, very intimidated, but I recognize sort of the value and importance of sort of being out there and being in the public sphere. And so, yeah.
So a couple of you have mentioned, that sometimes what we hear when we sit in the pews isn't great. So what about the opposite question? How do we do theology in a way that empowers people to read scripture for themselves rather than make them feel that you can't read scripture properly unless you've got a degree in theology? So how do we do theology in a way that empowers and frees? George?
So I must confess that the New Testament scholarship almost has become a kind of Royal Society for philately. I mean, it's about the minutiae, details, and never about the essence of the gospel. So I think also being invited to an event like this reminds us of like you said, 1 point, making it clear. And I think what helps, particularly in the case of the New Testament, is always to look for the good news, the gospel as good news. So what is the good news? And I think that's a comparative exercise. So therefore, this is good news compared to the news on CNN and BBC. So how do you articulate it? And I think that is what must be recognized. And if I go to I worship here in the Anglican Church. So the average Anglican sermon often is, it starts with a joke, then it is contained in the intertextuality between the Old Testament reading and the New Testament reading, and then it leads to the Eucharist. So I find, as a New Testament teacher, now my responsibility to point out the good news in the New Testament, so that people preach about the good news and not about the lectionary. So that's just my very brief response. Now for very measured response.
Well, this is just one thought, which is, we have lots and lots of wonderful commentaries on every level. Commentaries that are easy to read, commentaries that are very demanding and deal with the Greek and the Hebrew and everything. We're not short of good commentaries for any level or kind of interest. The problem, I think, lies in the fact that, if you're preaching a sermon, you might look at the commentaries on that particular text, and you can get the details of the text right if you take the trouble with commentaries. But I actually think to be a good preacher, or to be a good lay Christian understanding the Bible, you need biblical theology. In other words, you need a grasp of the overall scope of the scriptures, of the scriptural narrative, of who God is, in all these writings from so long ago, who Jesus is in the New Testament, what is the significance of the resurrection of Jesus? These big questions of biblical theology, I think, are vital if you're going to understand the real significance of any particular passage that you may be looking at and preaching on. So I think that would be our greatest need, I think, is to have accessible, and work on biblical theology is very difficult to do by scholars because we all feel we're specialists and it drags them out of our specialism. And there are lots of books about, well, you know, there are some good books about New Testament theology. There are very few good books about both Testaments, biblical theology, putting the two Testaments together. But that was what we were meant to do when the church put the canon together. They meant us to read the Old and the New Testaments together, and the New Testament is a sequel to the Old Testament. So we need good biblical theology that enables us to grasp the point of the whole of the Scriptures.
What are the good ones?
You'll see on the bookstall a little book. It's almost my most recent book, and it's at the bargain price of £10, and it's called "Who Is God?" Subtitle: Key Moments of Biblical Revelation. Oh, you got it. There you are.
It is good.
But it is. I mean, it's a small book. I gave it 4 lectures, so it's only a small attempt to look at who God is in both Testaments. That's a distinctive thing I was trying to do.
But it also, you say it's a small book, but it opens up a lot of stuff.
I hope so.
Thank you. Do we have anything from either of you?
Well, I mean, I think the main thing about it is that whatever you say, it must be relevant to the situation of those who are listening. Dragging on my own memories once again, the very, very first sermon that I really preached within the context of the service was on Philippians 2. And afterwards, the minister who'd been in charge of the service said to me, "That was excellent theology. I just have one question. What has it got to do with the Monday morning wash tub?" You see how long ago this was.
Yes.
This was when you did the washing. What has it got to do with ordinary life? Now, I would retort to him now, well, if there isn't any relevance, then it was rotten theology. Theology has got to be relevant to the situation of those who are listening.
Yeah, and I'll just say the best sermons I've heard are the ones that, from the passage, and specifically from the passage, not pulling from, 10 different passages necessarily, but from the passage, what do I learn about God? His character? What do I learn about what he's done? And as Morna said, why does that matter to me today? So those are the sort of 3 things that I think about, yeah.
Thank you. To go abroad, Richard.
Sorry, can I just add something that occurs to me? Because we talk mostly about sermons, and your question, I think, was a wider one. And we shouldn't think that Christians in the pews should be getting their faith, their understanding of the faith, only from sermons. I mean, sermons can do a limited job. And it always strikes me that a lot of our congregations, lots of people in them are highly educated. They read serious books about things they're interested in, including their professional interest and so on. They ought to be reading serious books about their faith. Sometimes they are, sometimes it never occurs to them. But I think we need to encourage people, and of course group Bible studies, people learn in a way that they don't just listening to a sermon. People engage in participatory Bible study, learn in a different way. So I think we've got to think about these different contexts in which people learn about the faith and about the Bible, which is part of self-learning, group learning, listening to, and we need to do other things in church besides sermons, put on a series of special lectures on this. There are so many people I find now who don't know anything about the Old Testament story. They really don't know whether Moses came before Abraham or not. And if you're at that level, it's actually quite difficult to get into the text. we need to do some rather basic education, which used to happen to everyone at Sunday school, no longer does to a large extent because most people don't go to Sunday school. People who are coming into the church now for the first time don't have that. So I think we've got to think about all sorts of ways in which theology can resource the life of the church.
Thank you. So to kind of bring that to the kind of bigger picture of the church more extensively, when I worked for the National Church, I was theological advisor to the House of Bishops, which meant that I was involved in lots of projects the church does. And one of the really difficult things to get people to understand is that we don't just do theology by writing books. We do theology when we make decisions. So, for instance, I had this long conversation with the church commissioners at times saying, when you make investment decisions or when you decide what to fund and what not to fund, this says something about the theology of the church. The question is not whether it's theological, but whether we're aware of what theology we're doing or not. But it felt like there was often impatience with theology, because theology takes time. Because theology doesn't always give us the answer we want to get or give us an answer at all. And I'm just wondering in general, how do you kind of, what do you see when you look at churches on the big picture and the doing of theology? How do we respond to those who say, well, what matters is to get, is to stem church decline and just go for church growth instead? How does theology resource us to be the church in a good way, to be faithful?
So I found the article. I'm not sure how widespread it is. Your article and Peter Welby's article, assessment. Is it out there?
Only the select few.
Okay.
Panel and a few
So
others.
very interesting. So you pointed out in your draft article that of course the bishops in the church of England have a responsibility for theology. I think they, formally speaking,
I'm a Baptist, just so everyone knows.
Yeah. But so I have very positive experience with Martin Seeley, the Bishop of Suffolk, and who invited me to lecture on the lectionary every year, and it is splendid. So about 150 clergy and lay preachers coming together, and it's interesting to teach to students, but even more so to teach to priests, because they have the weekly obligation to produce a sermon. They are highly knowledgeable, but I think it is only his initiative. I've seen a few other practices around the country, but I'm surprised that not every bishop would invite staff members of biblical studies to lecture on the lectionary. At least it is helpful for the lecturers themselves, that they are reminded of their
It is, and to be fair, just yesterday I got an invitation from Ely to speak in their clergy conference ahead of the lectionary. So every year they have a study day for their clergy ahead, looking at the lectionary gospel. Because with the Church of England, we only preach on the gospel some of the time. As an Old Testament scholar, I find that But thank you. Any other thoughts on theology more widely in the work of the church?
One of the things that occurs to me is that if our leaders in the church, people who are making decisions and speaking on all sorts of subjects and so on, if they don't have a good Christian theological framework in which to think about things, what actually happens is that currents of secular thought become the influential factors. Now, I don't in the least mean to say that we can't learn from what secular people are concerned about and write about and think about. We can, of course, but we ought to do it by way of critical engagement from a Christian theological standpoint. And the danger is, I think, that if you don't have do you remember a long time ago, G.K. Chesterton said, when people give up believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. Similarly, one might say, if people give up knowing about Christian theology, if church leaders give up knowing about Christian theology, that they don't have no ideological guidance. That they too often have non-Christian theological guidance, uncritical following of trends in intellectual. We ought to keep up with those trends. It's terribly important, but we ought to have a theological critique and engagement with them.
I add something?
I think it is very important. I think I'm struck by Paul's verse in 2 Corinthians 4. I've even written it out. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world, the God of this io, this zeitgeist. I don't think there's an English word for zeitgeist, is there? Zeitgeist. So I don't think the translation God of this world is good. It's very Martianite. The point is that this is the God of this zeitgeist has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel. So I think that apart from the positive emphasis on the gospel as good news, we also need this critical attitude of being so cultured that we understand what is wrong in the current zeitgeist.
And we might want to add, actually, that applies within the church as well. That actually doing theology allows us to ask very deep questions of ourselves in the face of our own failings in the church, which are at times considerable. No? Okay, we've got about 15 minutes now when we could take questions from the audience. So that's taking your life in your own hands to a degree. As to whatever people can ask. Do we have a roving mic? Or do you need this one?
The one in your hand.
There's one in my hand. Can you do the running, Matt? It goes well with the t-shirt.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Any questions for our panelists? Jess.
Do you think in the Church of England we've lost sight of the fact that the church is itself a theological idea and a theological reality? And if we don't grasp that, we'll be asking quite ludicrous questions, really. Does the church need theology?
Well,
George has written on ecclesia, church, so.
Being exposed by his students. So I think indeed the very term church is very important to reflect upon. Namely, the original Greek is assembly. So we are the assembly of God, which runs parallel to society, and the assembly, the civic assembly of society. So I think to understand what the church is very, very important. For instance, in my understanding, we are not a political society. Mm-hmm. And it seems that often, perhaps also encouraged by the notion of the state church, I'm not sure, we are encouraged to think that the church is political, but it is not in the New Testament. So I think this is crucial to understand what the church is about.
I'll just say, I care a lot about, that term ecclesia, and I think, appropriately, assembly, that the fact that word was chosen, and that it was a word that was known, they knew what assembly meant, and could see it in a civic context. But for the, Christians to have sort of utilized that word, and for Paul and writer Acts to use that word, I think is really telling, right? The church, and one thing I really appreciate about Church of England, coming from a Methodist background and an American and Korean context where church splits are so common, and it's like, oh, we disagree, let's split, I felt historically the Church of England, despite its origins, has really struggled. One thing I respected about it is that they really tried as much as possible to keep together, be unified. It's like, oh, we disagree. In the New Testament, Cambridge, we have a lot of disagreements. But you'll be best man at the wedding, and you'll be godfather to someone's children, even though you hate each other's theology or scholarship. And I love that because that is we are supposed to be one community. We're supposed to gather together, support each other, love each other. And I think that is certainly in the American and Korean context that I was familiar with. That part is very much largely missing. And we sort of forget that the church started off as just these little house church sort of gatherings of just maybe a couple dozen people. That's, whoever had the biggest house, And so, sort of retaining that as much as possible and sort of having that atmosphere, even if your church is like several hundred people, I think is really beautiful.
Thank you very much.
in the light of Gaza, Israel and Iran, and people preaching this coming Sunday, how would you preach on the massacre of the Amalekites?
That's Old Testament.
I remember a sermon on the massacre of the Amalekites, and it was given by the priest officiating at my niece's wedding. Can you believe that? I won't try to explain why it came to mind for him, but well, I mean, I don't think that one has to preach on the massacre of the Amalekites in order to address what's going on in the Middle East. I think that at the moment we need to address the sort of the impact that world news is having on everybody. The way it's creating depression and despair. You know, all kinds of things have been going on. The news is even more than usual, full of things one can hardly bear to watch. We need to preach about that situation, I think, because I think that's what the people in our pews need to cope with. And I think we need a stern message of actually that's what the world has always been like. It's what Jesus says in the beginning of Mark 13. This is but the beginning of troubles. The beginning of troubles is history as usual. That's what the world is always like. And what we must expect is not that the world has been getting better for the past 200 years, the myth of progress that so many people were brainwashed into. I think what is difficult for a lot of people is to realise that there actually hasn't been progress. You know, that enlightenment myth that we've all lived by has become bankrupt, and we need to talk about the work of God within a world in which there is a great deal of evil.
The short answer to this is I wouldn't. I mean, I preach on anything except the destruction of the Amalekites, but one has to see this in context. People sometimes misunderstand what God is saying to them. They don't always get it right. And the Bible is full of examples. We don't necessarily want to do everything that is suggested as a way forward in the Bible, because people may have got it wrong, and we need to recognize that. And one of the dangers here is on just landing on a text and using that. You can prove anything from the Bible if you want to, but you've got to see it in the context of what God is doing through history, and people coming to understand that behind everything there is this God of love.
Seth, and then you. Yeah.
Yes, hello. It's a pleasure to be here and listen to you guys. I'm Dr. Byers' student, also from America. Sorry about that. So I guess on this topic of suffering, right? Something we all go through and something we all face. What does it mean for you guys, not only to preach, but to speak to people about what they're going through? Because I think I find in my generation, one of the biggest things that drives people away from God is, if God is real or if he's good, how could this happen to me? What has happened in the world? So what does it mean to have a very practical theology for people in this world to speak to that kind of suffering that they're facing? How do you help it make sense to them? That maybe we can have theological ideas that are really high and mighty and that are inaccessible, but to the person who's suffering in their everyday, how do we speak to them?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, Seth was asking about suffering. How does theology help us address suffering, particularly for younger generations trying to make sense of suffering in the world and in their lives?
Well, I would start with the cross. That's what it's all about. This is the heart of the gospel. Here is God suffering. I mean, that was branded as a heresy by the early church, of course, to talk about God suffering. But here is the Son of God suffering and refusing to opt out, as it were. So this is the heart of our faith, that redemption comes through the acceptance of suffering, not meaning that we don't do anything to prevent suffering when we can, but when it comes to us, we have to make sense of it in our own lives through the power of God.
Just interject as panel leader, but one of the best books I've read on this is written by my friend John Swinton. He's practical theologian, he's Aberdeen. It's called Raging with Compassion, and he explores why he thinks theodicy is actually a hindrance in good pastoral responses to suffering, because he says that's an attempt to explain it away, but actually what a suffering person needs is not an explanation. It's not theology in that pure sense. What they need is an encounter, what they need is presence. And a little bit like you see in the book of Job, where there's almost an attempt to build a theodicy throughout, but Job finds resolution to some of what he faces, not in an intellectual answer, but in encounter with God. And I always find that really, really helpful. But John would say it much better than I can.
Thank you. Both as a church leader and a theological educator, one of the things that I find, both with lay folk who I'm trying to encourage to preach, because I believe in the priesthood of all believers and lay ministry and want to train them up, but also with students who are both becoming preachers and being trained to be preachers, is the perception on sort of day one that theology is this thing that's in the academy, and preaching is the therapy that you do in the pulpit, which seems to be somehow abstracted from theology. So the purpose of preaching is simply to meet need, rather than, or a perceived need, rather than to teach theology. So this idea that theology is, preaching is therapy before it's history or philosophy or theology or anything else. And I wondered if you had some advice on how to bring those things together for the upcoming preacher who's coming in with that assumption that theology is in the academy and therapy is in the pulpit, which is my sort of lived experience.
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, because I think fundamentally I don't think those are two different things. I think therapy has to be informed by theology. If it's going to be Christian therapy rather than just counselling, you know. But I do think that, you know, a 15-minute sermon every Sunday is just not enough to do all these things, you know. It needs to be theologically informed. It needs to address that congregation where they are. But I think increasingly people, and you know, the other thing that often strikes me now, being as old as I am, is observing how so many people now come to church irregularly. So they don't even get their 15 minutes every Sunday. When I was young, if you went to church at all, you went every Sunday. You didn't think about it. It doesn't, for all sorts of reasons, that no longer happens. I think people are just not getting enough instruction, if you like, in the broadest sense, and we need to think about how to provide it for people in addition to that Sunday slot.
Yeah, it just reminds me of what I was saying earlier about when I was a kid, and you know, if you wanted to learn about wisdom, you know, I wanted to grow in wisdom, or yeah, if you want to learn about suffering, or I was having an issue with, you know, one of the things I wanted to learn more about was anger and how to deal with it. Yeah, it's like, where do you get that information from? What's your source? And yeah, and I think if God is truly the source, you know, if he's the best answer, if he's the absolute truth, if I can fundamentally get better through him, yeah, then we have to know, theology, study of God. We need to know God, and we need to know who he is and what he's done. How is that? Yeah, that's the best therapy. He's the best source for. He's the best counselor. And so maybe phrasing it like that can be helpful to people who see that divide.
I'm a bit unhappy about talking about what happens in the pulpit as therapy. It sounds as though you sort of go to the bathroom cupboard and get out your tin of Band-Aids and stick them on. Surely what we're doing in a church service is far more than just looking for something to prop me up and carry me on through the rest of the week. It's a re-engaging of yourself with God. It's a refocusing. It's a thought about what the church is meant to be doing. It's not just people who are being called out. Why have they been called out? They've been called out in order to go out and to be the church in the community. So I'm not sure that sticking labels on what we do is terribly helpful.
Yeah, I don't agree with the divide. I see it as a problem, but how to deal with it is
Yeah.
what.
So you're on my side.
Oh, totally, yeah.
That's all right.
Well, that's a good place to end. I'm afraid we have no more time for questions. I'm sorry to those of you who still wanted to ask some, but our panel will be here during the day, so you can always bother them at lunch. So please, everybody, can you join me in saying thank you to all of you. Now, next today, we're going to have a short break until workshops begin at 12:15. But first, I'd like to invite our workshop leaders to come up, tell us about their topics and where they will be meeting. As they come to the stage, I'll tell you about the workshop I'm doing, which will be in the lecture hall, which is over there, on safeguarding and asking, can theology help us enrich our understanding of what it is we're doing when we're talking about safeguarding? What does theology have to say that's positive about safeguarding? And can theology help us ask questions of our safeguarding practices and policies as well? So that will be in the lecture hall with me, Andy.
My workshop is on theology on the digital frontier. And I'm thinking about the big ideas and the perspectives that, as Richard pointed out, the secular currents that are influencing the way we think about technology and development, and how theology might resource and challenge some of those.
Where?
Thank you. Seminar room 2. It's back there in the corner of that building in that direction. Seminar room 2. Thanks.